Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I want you to imagine for a moment that you have this massive reservoir of water.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Like a huge man-made lake or something.
Yeah, a huge lake. And you decide to release it, right? But you carve out 1,000 different tiny little streams to let the water out.
So you're just spreading it everywhere.
Exactly. I mean, you pour all your energy, all your resources, all your time into making sure that water trickles into every conceivable direction.
Right.
You have a stream for your career, a stream for your hobbies, one for your social status, maybe a stream for your financial portfolio.
Of the modern, well-rounded life.
Right. And you stand back and look at this sprawling network of activity. But then you realize something really devastating.
Which is?
When you try to float a tiny paper boat, like a little cockleshell boat, down any of those streams, it runs aground.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you have all this water, but because it is spread so incredibly thin, none of those channels have the depth to carry anything of actual weight.
That is a staggering visual. I mean, you have all the kinetic energy, all the motion, but zero capacity to sustain anything substantial.
Yes, the water is there, but the force is just, it's entirely lost.
So today we are looking at a man who saw the Christian life and demanded that we dam up all those tiny distracting streams, right?
We are looking at Charles Haddon Spurgeon, and specifically his work, The Soul Winner, Soul Saving Our One Business.
And he takes that modern ideal, the person who dabbles in a little bit of everything, and he just flips it completely upside down.
He really does. He argues that a Christian has one singular, all-consuming objective, and that objective is saving souls.
Right, and Spurgeon contrasts that image of the divided, shallow streams with a mighty river flowing violently between its banks.
It's a completely different picture.
It is, because when you constrain the water to one direction, it gains the strength to bear a multitude of heavy ships straight to the ocean.
It becomes concentrated.
Concentrated, directed, and unstoppable.
So, for this deep dive, we are going to unpack Spurgeon's reasons for this fierce dedication. And we will look at his shockingly practical methods for making that rescue mission happen.
Which are intense, by the way.
Very. But before we get into the mechanics of it, we have to talk about the standard he sets. When Spurgeon pictures this mighty river, he points straight to the Apostle Paul.
Yes, he brings up 1 Corinthians 9:22, where Paul says he is made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some.
Paul was just a man possessed by a master passion.
He was. He had one singular goal in front of his eyes at all times. But what stands out in Spurgeon's text is how he approaches Paul.
He issues a pretty strict warning to his congregation about this, doesn't he?
He does. He tells them outright not to place Paul on some inaccessible pedestal.
Which is something we do constantly, you know? We look at historical figures, especially biblical giants, and we elevate them into this superhuman category.
We do it because it gives us a really convenient excuse.
Right. We read about Paul being beaten, shipwrecked, and constantly preaching, and we say, well, that was the Apostle Paul. He had a special calling.
I could never operate at that level.
Yeah, it's a defense mechanism.
It totally is. By making Paul an exception to the rule, we just let ourselves off the hook. But Spurgeon violently strips away that excuse.
How so?
He argues that modern believers share the exact same fundamental realities that Paul experienced.
Okay, so breaking that down.
Right. So if you are a Christian, you have received the same free pardon. You have the same Holy Spirit dwelling inside of you.
You've been brought out of the same spiritual darkness into the same light?
Precisely. The grace that saved the Apostle Paul is the same grace that saves, a modern worker in a factory or a mother raising children.
Therefore, Spurgeon insists you should expect the same fruit from the same seed.
Exactly. Paul is not an anomaly to be worshipped from afar. He is the standard to be imitated.
So if Paul is the baseline expectation, we need to define what that standard actually looks like in practice.
And Spurgeon begins by redefining what the true objective of the church actually is.
And he does this by aggressively clearing the table of things that churches love to prioritize.
Oh, he calls out ministers who step into a pulpit with the goal of tickling ears, amusing crowds, or simply educating people.
He is incredibly blunt about this.
He looks out at the landscape of the church. And remember, he is addressing a wide array of workers here, from prominent ministers to Sunday school teachers to city missionaries.
And he asks them a piercing question.
He asks, are you trying to save souls or are you trying to entertain them?
Because he notices this growing, dangerous trend where the church begins to think its primary job is to train mental faculties.
Right. The church starts trying to prepare people for secular callings or, to introduce them to polite arts, literature, and poetry.
Which sounds great on paper to a modern ear. I mean, we love education.
And Spurgeon is not anti-intellectual. Let's be clear about that.
No, he explicitly praises the national system of education in his writing. He says he rejoices that children will have the keys of knowledge in their hands and learn to read.
But he draws a massive, unyielding line when it comes to the church's business.
He states that if the church substitutes education for salvation, it becomes a traitor to the master.
The gravity of that phrase is it's massive. A traitor.
Spurgeon argues that polishing a person's intellect without addressing their eternal state is a catastrophic failure.
Because he views humanity through the lens of eternity.
Right. So when he looks at a highly educated person who does not know Christ, he asks a really haunting question.
He asks, of what avail will it be to a man to be educated when he comes to face final judgment?
Think about that visual for a second. The trumpet sounds, the sky rolls back, the reality of the Creator is laid bare, and being able to, quote, Shakespeare.
Or understand advanced mathematics?
Yeah, that will offer absolutely zero cover.
Spot on. And Spurgeon brings this down to the ground level of, like, a Sunday school teacher.
What does he say to them?
He says, if a teacher has only taught a child to read the Bible or to repeat hymns from memory, they have not yet touched their true vocation.
The hammer must come down on this one single head. The soul must be saved.
He pushes back heavily against the idea that the primary goal of preaching is moralizing men.
You mean teaching them their civic duties towards their neighbors?
Yeah, or how to be polite members of society.
To really drive this home, he brings up a fascinating piece of history regarding Dr. Thomas Chalmers.
Yes. Chalmers was a very prominent Scottish minister.
And the story of Chalmers perfectly illustrates the dead end of preaching. The dead end of preaching just basic morality.
It really does. Chalmers provides a perfect historical case study for Spurgeon's argument.
Set the scene for us.
So in his first parish at Kilmeny, Chalmers decided to preach strict, high morality.
Like behavioral modification.
Yeah, he spent all his energy and time exhorting his congregation to behave better, to be upright citizens, to stop stealing, to stop lying.
He was functioning as a moral policeman for the town.
That is a great way to put it. And Chalmers himself later recounted the result of those years of effort.
What happened?
He saw absolutely no positive fruit. The town did not change. The hearts of the people remained just as cold and prone to vice as before.
So what shifted?
Chalmers shifted his entire message. He stopped preaching behavioral modification and started preaching Christ crucified.
He began to preach the blood atonement and the necessity of grace.
Yes, and Chalmers noted that as soon as he made that shift, a buzz and a stir began in the parish.
Actual grace prevailed. People's lives began to alter radically.
And Spurgeon uses this historical record to make a logical point. He says, if you want perfumes, you must grow the flowers.
If you want motion in a corpse, you must first seek life for it.
Morality is the fruit of salvation, not the root. You cannot attach fruit to a dead branch and expect it to live.
Okay, let me push back on this, just playing the devil's advocate for the listener who is sitting here in our highly academic, modern society.
Bring it on.
Today, we view education and social morality as the highest possible goods a society can achieve. We fund massive, multi-billion-dollar initiatives for literacy, ethical training, and social reform.
True.
If someone is dedicating their entire life to teaching people to read or helping them become honest, upstanding members of their community, isn't that enough?
It sounds like it should be.
Right. Why does Spurgeon look at a lifetime of philanthropic, educational work and view it as falling tragically short of the mark?
That is the central tension of his era and ours. To understand his critique, we have to look closely at what Spurgeon means by the word saved.
He does not use that word lightly.
No, he breaks it down into three distinct, heavily theological components.
Let's go through them.
First, being saved means being born again. Spurgeon operates from the conviction that the old human nature is spiritually dead and entirely corrupt.
It cannot be salvaged.
It cannot be reformed, and it certainly cannot be educated into goodness.
He says the best thing to do with the old nature is to bury it.
Right. A person must receive a completely new nature implanted by the action of the Holy Spirit.
He compares it to being as fresh from the hand of God as Adam was on his first day in paradise.
You cannot educate a dead nature into life. Education only makes a dead nature more clever.
So it requires a supernatural resurrection, a completely new creation from the inside out.
Yes, and the second component is just as vital. He says being saved means being cleansed by atonement.
And to explain this, he leans heavily on the Old Testament imagery of the scapegoat from the book of Leviticus, right?
He does. Under the ancient Jewish law, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would symbolically lay his hands upon the head of a live goat, confessing the sins of the people.
And that goat was then led away into the wilderness, carrying the guilt with it.
Spurgeon applies this directly to Jesus of Nazareth. He says a person cannot be saved from their sin unless they put their hand, by faith, upon the head of Jesus, the great substitute.
The one who took the punishment in our place.
Yet learning to read does not remove the curse of the broken law. Being polite does not satisfy divine justice. Only a substitute can do that.
And the third component of being saved.
The third component is being purified from actually living in sin.
He is fiercely practical here.
Very. He says a man is not saved while he continues to live in his sin. He asked the congregation, how can a drunkard be considered saved from drunkenness while he still riots at the tavern as before?
How is a swearer saved from blasphemy while his mouth is still full of profanity?
True salvation always results in integrity, chastity, honesty, and righteousness.
So, returning to my pushback about modern education and moral advice, those things only clean the outside of the cup.
Spurgeon argues you will never achieve true, lasting morality without this new inward life, this substitutionary cleansing, and this divine purification happening first.
Okay, so if that is the objective, this complete supernatural overhaul of the human soul, what are the driving motivations?
Why does this consume him so thoroughly?
Exactly. This moves us into Spurgeon's specific reasons for his urgency. He outlines why this matters so much.
And his first reason is the dishonor done to God's name.
To really grasp the weight of this motivation, you have to mentally place yourself in the London of Spurgeon's day.
It was the heart of the British Empire, a massive, sprawling industrial metropolis filled with millions of people.
Spurgeon asks his congregation to pause and think about the sheer volume of dishonor done to God in that city in any single hour of the day.
He paints a very dark, sensory picture of the city streets.
He mentions the doors of the gin palaces constantly swinging on their hinges, swallowing people up.
He talks about the widespread profanity echoing at the drinking bars. He sees people polluting themselves, acting as absolute slaves to their base appetites.
And he expands his vision globally, too. He talks about the rampant idolatry in places like China and Hindustan.
He looks at the vast portions of the globe worshiping false prophets or bowing to statues.
He views all of this mass rebellion as a direct, personal affront to the Creator.
He uses this visceral Old Testament phrase. He describes this false worship and blatant sin as smoke in Jehovah's nose.
It is an image of constant, irritating provocation.
It is a striking metaphor. Spurgeon looks at the world and wonders at God's long-suffering patience.
He notes that God must often put his hand to the hilt of his sword, ready to ease himself of his adversaries and strike the earth in judgment.
For Spurgeon, soul winning is not just about helping people. It is fundamentally about reclaiming the honor of God's name from a world in open rebellion.
Every soul saved is a rebel brought to their knees to worship the true King.
And that leads directly to his second motivation, which is the extreme misery of the human race.
Now, we need to look carefully at how Spurgeon diagnoses the social conditions of his time.
And to be clear to you, the listener, we are looking at this strictly as historical reporters. We are impartially breaking down his 19th century view without endorsing it from any modern left-wing or right-wing political stance.
Right, we are just telling you what Spurgeon wrote. He does acknowledge that some poverty comes from unavoidable circumstances, which he calls a bitter ill that deserves deep sympathy.
But he then makes a very specific historical claim about the vast majority of the poverty he walked through in 19th century London.
Looking through the lens of a strict Victorian minister, Spurgeon firmly believed that a massive portion of the poverty he saw, he specifically estimates 3/4 of it, was not just circumstantial.
He believed it was tied directly to vice, wastefulness, want of forethought, idleness, and above all, drunkenness.
He labels drunkenness as the master evil of his society.
He describes the local liquor dens as infernal plague spots that generate an appalling amount of wretchedness.
He vividly describes the domestic nightmares happening behind closed doors.
It's pretty graphic.
It is. He talks about miserable homes where women tremble at the mere sound. The sheer sound of their husband's footstep on the stairs.
And children crouch in fear on a heap of straw in the corner because the man is returning reeling and violent from the gin palace.
This is the raw, gritty reality of the misery Spurgeon is confronting. He isn't sitting in an ivory tower. He is looking at the devastation of the slums.
And to explain how the gospel is the only adequate response to this, he brings in the metaphor of the deadly upas tree.
I found this part so interesting. What is the upas
The
tree?
upas tree is a fascinating historical and literary reference. It was a legendary poison tree from the island of Java.
Like a literal tree of death.
Yeah, the myths surrounding it claimed that the tree was so toxic it destroyed all plant and animal life for miles around it.
Oh, wow.
Birds flying over it would drop dead from the fumes, and poison constantly dripped from its branches, killing everything it touched.
And Spurgeon looks at the sprawling misery of London, the domestic abuse, the squalor, the raging addiction, and he likens it to the deadly poison dripping from the boughs of this upas tree.
Think about how modern society attempts to fix a tree like that.
Right. If we view social programs, economic stimulus, or educational initiatives through this metaphor, they're essentially attempts to clip the leaves or prune the branches of the poison tree.
You might make the tree look a little more aesthetically pleasing for a moment.
You might temporarily catch a few drops of poison before they hit the ground in one specific neighborhood.
But Spurgeon argues that the gospel of Jesus Christ is the only axe sharp enough and heavy enough to lay at the root of the tree.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. Spurgeon urges his Christian workers to hold that axe to the root and strike constantly.
He believes that if you keep swinging the gospel at the root of human depravity, eventually the huge trunk of the poison tree will rock to and fro and crash to the ground.
That is how he believes the city will actually be saved from wretchedness. You cannot cure the symptoms of a diseased society without killing the root disease in the human heart.
But if the temporal misery of the city wasn't enough to motivate a person, Spurgeon moves to his third and most severe reason.
He moves from the grim reality of the city streets into the terrifying reality of the eternal realm. He addresses the final destiny of souls.
This is where the tone of the text becomes intensely solemn. Spurgeon says that the veil hanging before us, separating this life from the next, is not penetrated by every casual glance.
But when the eye is touched with heavenly eye salve, a terrifying vision appears.
He looks beyond the present moment and sees myriads of unregenerate, unwashed spirits passing from their physical bodies, going up to the solemn bar of judgment.
And being banished from the presence of God into indescribable horrors.
He calls it the Valley of Decision.
He describes the moment the resurrection trumpet sounds. He pictures spirits returning from their prison house to be reunited with their bodies, standing before a great white throne.
And the visual he paints of these trembling multitudes is absolutely chilling.
He says they quiver like aspen leaves in a violent gale.
They look frantically for rocks to hide them from the face of the judge. They beg the mountains to open their bowels to conceal them, but the earth offers no escape.
And then he introduces the dread angel.
He pictures an angel taking a sharp sickle and reaping this massive multitude, cutting them up like tares destined for the oven.
He describes them being cast down into outer darkness, into a place of weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth.
Spurgeon admits to his congregation that seeing this doom causes his own heart to sink. He says the thought of it alone is enough to cause a person distress day and night.
But he doesn't leave his listeners stranded in the outer darkness. He immediately contrasts this terrifying imagery with the glorious vision of the saved.
He describes the spirits of the redeemed mounting up to heaven, their resurrected bodies ascending in glory.
And their nimble fingers striking harp strings to sing eternal praises for redeeming love.
The contrast is razor-sharp and entirely deliberate. On one side, you have the agonizing cries of a too-late awakening, people realizing their folly when the door is already shut.
On the other side, you have the sweet, unending notes of the redeemed singing, "Unto him that loved us and washed us from our sins in his own blood."
Spurgeon uses this massive dichotomy to fuel an overwhelming, almost frantic urgency.
He looks out at his congregation and pleads with them. He cries out, "Save some! By yonder flames and outer darkness, seek to save some."
He is making it very clear that this isn't a theoretical, theological debate for him. It is a literal, desperate rescue mission.
I want to ask you, the listener, to put yourself in Spurgeon's shoes for a moment. Try to adopt his worldview completely.
Okay, setting the scene.
Imagine you are walking into a large, crowded building. People are laughing, working, eating, going about their normal business.
Just a totally average day.
But you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the foundation of the building is currently engulfed in flames and the roof is seconds away from a catastrophic collapse.
How would you behave?
You certainly wouldn't pull up a chair and calmly teach the occupants how to arrange the living room furniture to get better natural light.
You wouldn't critique their choice of wallpaper or offer them a seminar on financial planning.
You would grab them by the arm, scream that the building is coming down, and drag them out the door. If you truly believe the flames are real, your entire demeanor changes.
It changes every single calculation you make. It strips away the superficiality of our daily encounters.
If you carry Spurgeon's perspective into your workplace, your neighborhood, or your home, every conversation you have is happening in the shadow of eternity.
Every interaction at the grocery store or over the backyard fence carries eternal weight.
Spurgeon even grounds this urgency in the incarnation itself.
Right. He points out that Jesus Christ left the glory of heaven and went down to the horror of the cross and the darkness of the grave, specifically for this rescue mission.
He tells his listeners, if you call yourself a follower of Christ, you must imitate your master.
Okay, so we feel the urgency. The stakes are literally heaven and hell. The motivation is God's honor and humanity's ruin.
But how do we actually execute this rescue mission? We are moving into the practical application now.
Spurgeon has laid out the what and the why, now he gives us the how.
He titles this concept The Methods of the Master Fisherman, and his first method is unapologetically straightforward.
His first method is simply preaching the gospel of Christ.
Specifically, he demands the preaching of the whole truth, without any hesitation, softening, or alteration.
He issues a stern warning against evangelists or ministers who try to create a false sensation by making startling, bizarre statements.
Or preaching erroneous doctrines just to draw a crowd. He says you have no right to state a false doctrine, even if you genuinely think it might save a soul.
The end does not justify the means when it comes to divine truth.
He tells his listeners to give the people every single doctrine, including the ones that are notoriously unpopular or offensive to modern sensibilities.
He explicitly mentions Calvinism.
He tells his workers that if they hold Calvinistic doctrine, they must not stutter about it, they must not stammer over it, but they must speak it out boldly.
That is a crucial historical point for Spurgeon. He lived through various religious awakenings, and he believed that many revivals faded quickly. He called them evanescent, precisely because they did not proclaim a full-orbed, robust gospel.
They skimped on the hard doctrine.
Right. He wanted every truth baptized in holy fire. But the absolute center of it all, the bell he tells his workers to ring constantly, is the cross of Christ.
The truth that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son as a substitute for sinners.
He literally tells the preacher, ring it, man. Ring it. Keep on ringing it.
And he takes a very sharp, almost sarcastic jab at the intellectual trends of his day.
Oh, he really goes after them.
He talks about cultured modern divines who are embarrassed by the simple, bloody message of the cross.
They say talking about Christ crucified is archaic, conventional, and antique. They want profound thinking, philosophical nuance, and science deified in the pulpit.
His observation on this trend is both humorous and biting.
He looks at the churches that have abandoned the cross for intellectualism, and he notes that wherever this new thinking drives out the old gospel, you will usually find more spiders than people in the pews.
The buildings are just empty.
But where there is the simple, unvarnished preaching of Jesus Christ bleeding for sinners, the place is crowded to the doors.
He tells his workers to gladly embrace the label of a fool. If sticking to the old truth of atonement by blood makes him look incapable of progressing with the intellectual spirit of the age, he is happy to be called a fool.
But preaching truth is only half the equation for Spurgeon. The expert delivery of doctrine, no matter how accurate, must be paired with something else.
Which brings us to the incredible anecdote of the stonebreaker.
This is one of the most beautiful illustrations in the text. Spurgeon describes a minister walking down a road and passing by a poor man who is breaking granite stones by the roadside.
The man is down on his knees, gripping his hammer, delivering heavy blows to the stone.
The minister stops, looks at him, and says, "Your work is just like mine. You have to break stones, and so do I."
And the stonebreaker looks up and replies, "Yes, and if you manage to break stony hearts, you will have to do it as I do, down on your knees."
It is such a vivid, tactile picture. You can almost hear the hammer hitting the granite. The point here is that you have to mix truth with fervent prayer.
You do. Spurgeon says the gospel alone will not be blessed to the salvation of souls unless we pray over our preaching.
He tells his workers that they must come straight from the closet of prayer to the pulpit, or from their knees straight to the Sunday school class.
He lays down a rule. Let us never venture to speak for God to men until we have spoken for men to God.
You have to prevail with God in secret if you want to have any hope of prevailing with men in public.
Think of it like swinging a heavy sledgehammer at a solid rock wall, but putting absolutely no muscle behind the swing.
You just let the hammer casually fall against the rock?
The tool is technically correct. The hammer is the exact right instrument for the job, but the physical kinetic force required to actually shatter the rock is entirely missing.
That is what preaching the truth without prayer is like, according to Spurgeon.
You have the right tool, the unvarnished, accurate theology, but you lack the spiritual force to break the stony human heart.
That analogy perfectly captures his theological mechanics. The truth provides the structural integrity of the hammer, but the Holy Spirit, accessed through fervent prayer, provides the kinetic energy to actually shatter the granite.
One without the other is useless.
So we have the unvarnished truth, and we have fervent prayer. This brings us to Spurgeon's final method,
Which is radical adaptation. He returns to the Apostle Paul's strategy of becoming all things to all men, and he applies it to the everyday worker.
This method requires an intense, almost unnatural level of sympathy.
Spurgeon points out that when Paul talked to a Jewish audience, he didn't blurt out that he was the apostle to the Gentiles and flaunt his freedom from the ceremonial law.
Instead, he spoke as a Jew, focusing heavily on Old Testament prophecies from books like Isaiah to point them gently to Jesus.
When Paul met a Gentile, he dropped any Jewish squeamishness, ate with them, and talked with them on their level.
When he stood before Greek philosophers in Athens, he quoted their own poets and spoke with polished language suited for a philosopher. He adapted his approach entirely to fit the listener.
And Spurgeon gives some wild, highly practical examples of this from history. He mentions Hudson Taylor, the famous missionary who founded the China Inland Mission.
Hudson Taylor is a prime historical example of this radical adaptation. Taylor realized that to reach the Chinese people in the interior, he needed to remove as many cultural barriers as humanly possible.
If he showed up looking like a British gentleman, they would never hear his message. They would only see a foreigner.
So he dyed his hair black, grew a pigtail, dressed in traditional Chinese clothing, and lived exactly as they did.
Spurgeon praises this as a truly wise policy. He tells his workers that we are bound to be Chinese to the Chinese if we want to save the Chinese.
He even points to Jesus himself to prove this point. Spurgeon says that if Jesus were walking around 19th century London, he wouldn't be wearing the gaudy, elaborate vestments and robes that some high church ministers delighted in wearing.
He notes that Jesus wore a seamless garment, which Spurgeon translates into plain Victorian English as a smock frock.
The common, everyday work clothes of his countrymen.
Spurgeon is arguing that ministers should wear the costume most like the dress of their hearers.
They need to associate with them and be one among them, not stand above them as some elite clerical class.
He mentions George Whitefield, the great open-air preacher of the 18th century.
Whitefield called his chapel at Moorfields a soul trap.
Whitefield wasn't offended by the term. He was delighted by it. He wanted his chapel to be a trap to catch souls, and he was willing to use every art and artifice a fisherman uses to land a catch.
And Spurgeon takes this massive concept and applies it to the regular workers sitting in the pews.
He says if you teach children in Sunday school, make yourself a child. Get down on their level.
If you visit the sick, speak to them the way you would desperately want to be spoken to if you were the one lying in a sickbed in pain.
He even says that if you are dealing with rough characters in the slums, you must come down to their rough style of language to get a hold of them.
You cannot pull people out of the water while standing on a high, dry bridge. You have to stoop down into the muck.
It is a brilliant observation on human nature and communication. We naturally build artificial walls of propriety, culture, and preference around ourselves.
Spurgeon is telling his workers to tear every single one of those walls down. Sink your own pride.
Now, I have to raise a critical tension in the text here because it feels like a contradiction.
Okay, let's look at it.
On one hand, in the first method we discussed, Spurgeon fiercely demands that we never alter or soften the harsh doctrines.
Right, preach the unvarnished truth.
We must preach the truth, including the parts that deeply offend modern sensibilities, like human depravity or the blood atonement. We cannot budge an inch.
But here, in this final method, he demands that we alter absolutely everything about our personal preferences, our dress, our speech, and our cultural habits to suit the listener.
How do we reconcile this? How do you hold rigid, uncompromising doctrine in one hand and total, radical fluidity in the other?
That tension is the absolute genius of Spurgeon's pastoral theology. The resolution lies in drawing a sharp, unmistakable line between the message and the messenger.
The message, the cross, the atonement, the necessity of the new birth is fixed divine and unalterable.
You cannot soften it, you cannot negotiate it, you cannot change it, but the messenger must be entirely fluid.
Spurgeon tells his workers to throw overboard all peculiarities and yield 1,000 indifferent points.
You sink your own pride, you abandon your conventionality, and you give up your rights to ensure that the only stumbling block the listener encounters is the cross itself.
Not your weird cultural quirks or your stubborn refusal to adapt to their setting.
So if they're going to trip and fall, make absolutely sure they trip over the gospel, not over your refusal to wear a smock frock or speak their dialect.
Precisely. The messenger becomes invisible, so the message can become unavoidable.
This brings us to the final thought of our deep dive. We've covered the objective of the new birth, the motivations of God's honor in human misery, the terrifying eternal stakes, and the practical methods of truth, prayer, and adaptation.
But there is a final provocative thought drawn from the text that we withheld until now.
In the middle of his sermon, Spurgeon turns from his broad vision of the city of London and the great white throne, and he points directly at the individuals sitting in his congregation.
He looks them in the eye and asks a piercing, deeply uncomfortable question. How many others have you brought to Christ?
It is a moment of intense personal reckoning in the text. He pauses the grand theological discourse and asks them if they can recollect even one single person they have personally led to Jesus.
And if they cannot, he introduces this devastating concept of being spiritually childless.
To explain this, he references the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, who was told concerning a rebellious king named Coniah, "Write ye this man childless."
In ancient Israel, to be written childless was considered a fearful, tragic curse.
Spurgeon looks at his congregation and asks, "Shall I write you childless? Your children are not saved, your wife is not saved, and you are spiritually childless. Can you bear this thought?"
I want you to mull this over as we close. We spend so much of our lives building our resumes.
We acquire wealth, we educate ourselves, we expand our influence in our secular callings.
We dig 1,000 tiny streams to make sure we are well-rounded and successful by the world's standards.
But if Spurgeon is right, if saving souls is the supreme business of life, the only mighty river that actually matters in the end, what does an individual's legacy actually look like when all earthly accolades, wealth, and education fade away?
If you arrive at the end of it all, highly educated, widely traveled, heavily amused, but you arrive spiritually childless, what was it all for?
It forces a complete, ground-up reevaluation of what we consider a successful human life.
It really does. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. I encourage you to take this perspective into your own daily interactions this week. Look at the people around you, your coworkers, your family, the person at the coffee shop, not just as passing acquaintances, but as immortal souls heading toward eternity. Have a great week.